Um, Dr. Reynolds was on my dissertation committee when I was at Indiana University. So that's how I know her. But you were born in Connecticut, right? I see you went to undergraduate and your master's at the University of Connecticut. Yeah, okay. And then she did her PhD at UC Berkeley. So pretty prestigious there, working with, if I remember, was that Stuart Chapin?
Yeah, at Terry
Okay.
Chapin, he goes by, but
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Carla D'Antonio too.
Oh, right. That's right. I knew that. I just forgot. Okay. So my Googling was only semi-successful. And then she did a postdoc at a really well-known field station at the University of Michigan's field station, the Kellogg Biological Station. And then she started her work at Indiana University in 2000, which for some reason it slipped my mind. That's when I started as a PhD student there. So yeah, we started there at the same year. And what I really loved about working with and learning from Dr. Reynolds was that she always had this perspective of applied ecology, which to me was new. And also I took a service learning class from her. And so the perspective of including kind of applied work and outreach in one's research for me originated with Dr. Reynolds. So I'm really excited to hear her talk because she continues to do that type of work for her research. So I'm going to stop talking so I don't go on too long, and let's go ahead and hear from Dr. Reynolds.
All right, sharing my screen here. Can you all see it? Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, I'm trying to, there we go. Now, let me just take a second and get rid of the gallery so that I can see my screen better. Okay. Yeah, now I can't see anybody though, so that could be dangerous. Well, anyway. Hey, everybody. It's great to be here today. Thank you, Jen, for that introduction. It's great to be here, even though we are Zooming it. I am excited to talk to you about some of our plants in the city research. Before I do, I just want to take a brief minute to give you a broad overview of the Reynolds Lab and our broad focus on the community ecology of plant environment interactions, which is really motivated by two overarching research questions. First, what ecological and actually increasingly what social ecological factors shape the diversity and abundance of plants and communities? And then how can we apply this understanding to create more sustainable and resilient habitat restorations, agricultural systems, and urban areas? So as Jen mentioned, we do sort of span the basic to applied research continuum. So as plant ecologists, our approaches typically are greenhouse and field experiments using relatively simple tools of plant ecologists like paper bags and quadrats and transects and things. Although as we move into more urban ecology and social ecological ecology, we're adding GIS and also social surveys to our toolbox. And we've published a lot in the areas of plant-soil interactions that you see along the top of the screen, but we also publish in the socioecology of greening cities and the pedagogy of community engaged learning or service learning and environmental literacy, those topics that you see along the bottom of the screen. And those are the topics that I'm going to focus on today. Did somebody have a question? Okay. Pat, now I can see you. I changed it so I can at least see one person if you need to motion to me for any reason. All right. So with that, let me segue to some downtown ecology. This is what one of our study sites might look like today. This is downtown Indianapolis. And here's a tour guide for the rest of the talk. I want to start with just a little bit of background and rationale for greening cities, and then talk about a couple of different projects in the lab that have addressed different challenges of greening cities. And then I will wrap up with some future directions. So this quote by Thoreau probably resonates with all of us. It certainly always has with me. But I like to think about, is this twist on Thoreau's thesis equally true. After all, urban areas account for the majority of the world's population, well over 55% currently, and it will be up to 70% world population urban by 2050. Furthermore, the urban population resides on just a tiny sliver of Earth's terrestrial lands. So theoretically, that leaves a lot of room for preserving wildness, right? Well, of course, we know it's not so simple as that, because today's cities do have vast ecological footprints. They import huge quantities of energy and resources and export huge quantities of waste to external productive areas of land and water, which are shown, represented by the area of land at the bottom of the screen, and collectively, these areas of productive land and water are known as the ecological footprint. And the ecological footprints of today's cities are just vast. They can be orders of magnitude higher, many orders of magnitude higher than the actual physical boundaries of the city. And of course, then, these natural lands that are being drawn from and polluted to are then co-opted and degraded, even if they're not, actually physically inhabited by the city and their residents. So maybe, though, we can fix the thesis this way. In green cities is the salvation of wildness. Certainly, green cities have the capacity to produce a lot of food. They can become more self-sufficient or autotrophic, self-feeding that way, as this urban farm in Chicago is showing. And through green spaces and the ecosystem services that are provided, greening cities can also produce many other types of services besides food. And so this all can help to shrink the amount of productive land and water that's required to draw from outside of the city. Green cities is, of course, an old concept. Here's just a few examples through history of various aspects of greening cities. And it's being reborn, really, as 21st century urban green infrastructure, which is defined, you can see at the bottom of the screen, as networks of green spaces that are intentionally managed for their multifunctional benefits, that is, their ecosystem services to people. And so this includes everything from the parks that we're so familiar with, riparian corridors, green roofs, food gardens, like I showed you in the previous slide, bioswales, and many other types, urban forests, many other types of urban green spaces that are each and producing often many different types of ecological services like air and water purification, climate control, carbon storage, aesthetics, you see all around the outside of this diagram. And of course, the great thing about urban green infrastructure is it is relatively solar powered. It's relatively reflective and permeable. And so it stands then to substantially reduce the amount of human-built gray infrastructure that we in turn then have to construct, which of course relies currently on huge imports of fossil fuel and energy, generates a lot of pollution, so is a big part of why cities' ecological footprints are so large. And then of course creates a lot of heat and flooding through its dark and hard surfaces. So it's very exciting, the potential. Oh, the other thing I want to mention is, unlike green infrastructure, which is so multifunctional, any one form of green infrastructure can actually produce a wide variety of services. Gray infrastructure is pretty much produced for one thing, like stormwater control. You've got these pipes underground, and it's not also going to be providing you aesthetics and food and all of these other things. So it's very unifunctional, which is another drawback. Okay, so green spaces, of course, besides providing these services for people, they're providing habitat, which supports biodiversity. And this gorgeous photo is again from Chicago, showing a lot of a prairie planting in, I think it's their Millennium Park, if I'm correct. And the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity has actually, in cities, has and their Cities and Biodiversity Outlook publication, which is really nice. I think it's from 2012, but it's really nice. And their key message number 2 is that rich biodiversity can exist in cities, and they go through a lot of different examples of this. So integrating nature with the built environment definitely has huge potential. There's a lot of excitement about it. It's being implemented around the world. Nature-based solutions is sort of the European phrasing for this. That's also starting to be used in the United States. It's attracted a lot of interest from students. So this class that I developed a few years ago called Biodiverse City, the Art and Science of Green Infrastructure, tripled in enrollment within the first few years that I offered it. On the other hand, it's definitely not just a simple matter to green cities and to do so effectively. There are many challenges involved that are well deserving of the attention of ecologists as well as lots of other experts. So one of the challenges is, of course, invasive species. So I want to turn to some of that work now. And sorry, I don't know if you can hear it, but I have like this major heavy equipment happening outside my window, and it's very distracting. So I'm trying not to be distracted. Anyway, back to invasive species in cities. Cities are, of course, ports of entry and centers of ornamental use of exotic and invasive species. You see the example on the left, purple winter creeper. You probably have that down in Kentucky as well. We have a lot of it in Bloomington. It's a very popular ground cover landscaping plant from Eurasia. And of course, all this use of invasives in cities makes urban green spaces especially vulnerable to being invaded by them. And on the right, you're seeing actually Dunn's Woods, which Jen Koslow will know fondly. It's a green space in the center of the Indiana University's Bloomington campus, which is definitely an urban environment. And you can see that's a sea of purple winter creeper in that system, where we've done a lot of work. And of course, what that's doing is dramatically reducing biodiversity. There would have been a diverse wildflower community in this area. And by swamping out that, there's also knock-on effects to higher trophic levels. All the insects and birds and other animals that rely on, of course, the primary producer level are also then being excluded. And with all the associated ecosystem services then that these communities, ecosystems would ordinarily provide are being swamped out. So what gives invasive species their advantage? This has been a perennial interest of my lab. And of course, solving it or answering it not only helps to advance basic ecological understanding, but is also going to help us with applied work to create more sustainable green spaces in cities and other areas. So, whoops, I didn't realize that was happening. So decades of research on invasive species, particularly invasive plants, have suggested that there's essentially two categories of mechanisms that will drive an invasion or be responsible for an invasion. So you have the driver model and the passenger model. And in the driver model, it is actually the invasive species themselves that are in the driver's seat that are driving their invasion. So traits of those species, maybe it's allelochemicals that they're producing that are, harming native plants or harming the microorganisms that native plants rely on, or maybe they have just especially rapid reproduction, for example. Those are some examples of invader traits that can cause this. In contrast, with the passenger model, it's not actually the traits of the invasive species. The invasive species is in the passenger seat. They're coming along for the ride on some sort of ecosystem properties that may have changed. They can be biotic or abiotic, but they're properties that tend to favor the invasive plant over native species. And one example might be herbivores that, herbivore pressure that is very intense on native plants, but these herbivores really haven't adapted, learned to eat the invasive plants, as one example. It could also be things like disturbances. It could be escape from soil pathogens, nutrient inputs. These are all, though, properties of the ecosystem rather than the invasive species. And so the invasive species is the symptom of underlying conditions rather than the cause. And it's really important that we try to make progress on understanding, which of these, or the relative importance of these different models for why invasive species invade, because they suggest different ways, right, of dealing with the invasion and restoring native biodiversity. With the driver model, it would suggest that if you can just remove the invasive plant from the system, you should be able to restore it. There may be some legacy effects you have to deal with, but removing the invasive plant should be the most important thing. On the other hand, with the passenger model, you definitely need to remove the invasive plant, but that's not going to solve the problem unless you also address the underlying symptoms that are creating the unfavorable conditions for native species. So, I want to turn to our restoration efforts in Dunn's Woods on campus, which have informed our research on passenger versus driver mechanisms of invasion. So the Bloomington Urban Woodlands Project is a coalition of academic, so Indiana University folks from different departments, as well as my lab and the biology department, as well as local governmental groups like City of Bloomington Parks and Recreation, and non-governmental groups like local invasive species task forces, for example. And we have gotten together over the years. We've joined forces to help put in practice, to engage in the practice of restoring green spaces, and in doing so to help educate people and figure out the best practices. So we have worked for many years to remove invasive species. I'm going to show you, I think I can, what you're seeing here is like an hour of work removing invasive species condensed into 12 seconds. And it's just one example of the kind of work we do. But in addition to removing the invasive species, then you can see from the photos along the bottom, we propagate plants, native plants, many different types, and plant them into the woodland, Dunn's Woods and other woodlands as well. And we've had some success. I mean, you can see we've seen bees and hummingbirds coming into the woodlands, visiting our plants. But we've also had a lot of challenge. And so even though we have gotten some native species to establish, and at the foreground, you can see great blue lobelia on the left and a little bit on the right. There's also some purple mist flower in there. Those are both nice native species, but you're also seeing a lot of bare ground there. And far more bare ground after years of thousands and thousands of native plugs that we put into this woodland and not seeing the recovery suggests that passenger dynamics, are happening. We're removing the invasive, and then we're still having trouble getting our native plants to establish. So suggest passenger dynamics. And in fact, what seems to be the big culprit is herbivore pressure. So browsing is in fact very evident on our native transplants. And in the picture on the left, you can see how the native sedge has been clipped off by some sort of mammalian herbivore. And an former undergraduate researcher in the lab, Rebecca Stoops, who you can see in the center, she put out track plates. These are just very simple acetate sheets with graphite powder on top. And she put them around our native plantings, and animals walk on them, and then they make an imprint and you can identify tracks. And in doing this, she found a lot of evidence for a lot of rabbit near our plantings. So we also put up wildlife cameras with the help of biology professor Roger Hangarter, shown at the bottom. Then we had a former high school researcher in the lab, Zoe Need, and she went through thousands of images of our wildlife cam data to sort of score what animals you were seeing. And this confirmed that rabbits, you can see from the graph, are the most hugely abundant animal in the woodland. So to nail this down further, we also started doing exclosure experiments in the woodland, which provided further evidence that strong herbivore pressure really seems to be the big limitation on the native species in this woodland. And this I'm showing you here, some of this research was done by other former undergraduate students in the lab, Chelsea Howard and Renee Albrecht, you can see at the bottom. And just that you can see from the picture, when we cage our native plantings, and I've tipped over the cage to take the picture, but you can see at the lower left, there's this diverse, flourishing, productive native community there. In contrast, for open cages, which have had little doorways cut into them to let rabbits and other small mammals in, this is just to create a cage control, a control for the actual metal structure being there. Or full controls, which you can barely see in the upper right. Those are just marked by bamboo stakes. In both of those situations, you get nothing, no natives able to flourish there. And the inset graph at the bottom just shows, the formal biomass data, highly significant difference in biomass when you protect these natives from herbivore pressure or not. And so again, all of this speaks to that we've got going here a passenger model of invasion as being really important with rabbits in the driver's seat. All right. So we're piloting both top-down and bottom-up strategies to try to reduce this herbivore pressure, alleviate it through top-down, for example. So this has involved so far putting out owl nest boxes, specific to owls like barred owls, shown in the photo, which do predate on rabbits. We haven't had a lot of success with this so far, but we do have the nest boxes out there. And we're also looking at bottom-up strategies. So we've propagated somewhere between 50 to 75 different species of native plants over the years. And we've noticed that some of them actually are not very palatable. They don't seem palatable to herbivores, and they do better. So I'm showing you a suite of some of those species that involve ferns, as well as some beautiful flowering forbs, even a succulent there, a sedum on the right. So we're focusing on putting these species in, so at least we're getting diversity into the woodland, and also starting some new tests of whether these species can actually be like a nurse community to more palatable species, that is, sort of make them less apparent, maybe hide them from herbivory while they're getting established. All right, so our research findings have also informed ongoing work to educate about urban woodlands. So I just wanted to briefly mention something about that. The Bloomington Urban Woodlands Project, in addition to the restoration work, we've also produced just a lot of educational literature over the years, and there's just sort of a sampling of those types of things. And again, we do it in an interdisciplinary way, so collaborating with artists and graphic designers to make really nice products. And this is all part of students' learning experiences, because this work is, a lot of these products have been produced by undergraduate and graduate students working with our project as service learners. Okay, where service learning formally then is, it's a course that is now working with community partners who are an alternative course text for the students. They provide obviously a very powerful experiential learning opportunities for the students, a way for them to apply the theory and concepts they're learning in class to real world situations, supporting community partner needs, and often producing products like you see on the screen. And I want to say I've done some pedagogical research in this area, working with social scientists, graduate student Eric Nakmuk and faculty James Farmer at IU, studying, to what extent service learning helps students to, advances their understanding, as well as gives them connection to their communities and agency in the world. And this is one example of a publication that we did, which found, even though I have to say, so this particular study was small, there weren't many students in the pool, and there were challenges in the techniques in that it was the students' perception is through surveys. But nonetheless, we were able to conclude from this study that service learning promoted actually lasting understanding of ecological issues, so well after the course had ended, and gave the students a sense of place, a sense of real world impact, and obviously a connection to nature. And one of my graduate students in the lab, Savannah Bennett, is following up on this research. She's extending it with more courses and more students. She's using more objective ways of testing student knowledge, so not just relying on surveys of their perceptions, but actually administering pre and post tests to get at their knowledge. And then she's comparing the efficacy of project-based service learning. That's when students are actually working with the community partners on more independent and creative projects, like and producing products like I showed you on the screen, versus direct service where they're doing important but more routine work for the partner that doesn't involve a lot of intellectual creativity. So she's in the process of analyzing and writing up that work now. And so we'll see what she finds. All right, I want to then turn in my remaining time to a very different project addressing a different challenge of greening cities, which is the challenge really of developing a good theoretical framework and associated tools for resilience of cities to climate change. So let me preface that by saying that, emphasizing how much urban green infrastructure really does need to be studied in the context of social ecological systems, because it is part of one. It is part of a coupled adaptive system that involves human components, so the social part, humans and their social institutions, their norms, all their technical and built capital, interacting with the natural capital of ecosystems, the organisms and their interactions with the physical and chemical environment. And so because of this complexity, you can see there's a lot of people on the bottom of the screen, and that's sort of just the tip of the iceberg, but these are a lot of interdisciplinary people that I work with, involving, social ecological system scientists, geographers, urban climatologists, in order to get this work done. Okay, so of course, we're all familiar. This is I forgot, a few years ago from somewhere in southern Indiana, where we're getting so much more used now to these impacts of climate change, from like really big floods, huge rainstorms, associated flooding, extreme heat in the summer. So planning for urban resilience has definitely become a priority. And I want to define social ecological system resilience. This is the definition I like. It is the ability to buffer, adapt, or transform, the ability of a social ecological system to do this so as to maintain functioning and well-being in the face of disturbance. So buffering helps to absorb disturbances, adapting helps to adjust to new norms as a way of dealing with disturbances. And then transformation is a way to make profound changes in the system that help to avoid the disturbance in the first place. So urban green infrastructure is increasingly being implemented as one way to help promote social ecological system resilience. And though there's less attention to date, there's this assumption that it's going to do this. And there's some good reasons to think about why. I mean, I mentioned the permeability of green infrastructure. So obviously that's going to help with absorbing flood water, for example. But there's been little attention to date on operationalizing resilience, thinking about what it mechanistically means, and then operationalizing that into planning and maintenance of green infrastructure. And so my work with the Urban Green Infrastructure Working Group, which involves those people I showed you at the bottom of the screen, mainly, has been to help develop a theoretical framework for operationalizing resilience into urban green infrastructure, and a framework that's explicitly social ecological and trait-based, and also developing associated mapping and analysis tools. So let me take you through a little bit of that work. So the first thing that we did was conduct a literature review. We wanted to identify the traits underlying buffering, adaptive, and transformative ability. Okay, so again, to get more mechanistic, what is it that we actually need to make sure the system has in terms of traits if we're going to have these resilience abilities? And so you can see at the bottom of the screen, I used keywords like social ecological system resilience, complex adaptive system resilience, urban resilience to identify literature and across different fields. And the other filter was I wanted publications that were trying to seek first principles of resilience through like structural traits of systems. Okay, so doing that literature search, here's what we came up with. It yielded 6 foundational resilience traits that underpin buffering, adaptive, and transformative ability. And these are diversity, redundancy, modularity, regenerative ability, connectivity, and equitability. And you can see the little icons to try to represent each trait. So, and just quickly, diversity, of course, we're all familiar with diversity, right? As like the source of raw material for adaptation, for example. Redundancy or component functional similarity is really important for buffering, right? So think about the spare tire, or the spare tire analogy is so apt. A spare tire is definitely redundant until you need it, right? So, and then it buffers the fact that you've had this disturbance of a punctured tire. Modularity refers to component independence, a sort of substructure, sort of independent substructures, modules, so to speak, in the system. And this, I think actually I have little definitions that come up with this that I could have been. And this helps, actually provides ease of replication after, should something be damaged, you don't have to recreate the whole thing, maybe just one module. It actually also helps with creativity, like ways of recombining things to generate new benefits, and limits the spread of harms. Okay, the fact that you have this independence, this modularity, means that, like, for example, a disease doesn't necessarily as easily sweep through a whole system. That's just one example of a way that harms are limited. Regenerative ability or self-renewability, which green infrastructure is clearly, right? Self-renewing, that's another great thing about it. Promotes recovery after damage. You can regrow much more easily. As yet, gray infrastructure can't do that. Connectivity refers to component linkage. So being able to promote essential flow of entities like organisms or even information flow through the system. This is obviously something that has to be balanced with modularity. They're kind of opposite sides of the coin, for example, and you And so you need to balance them, figure out what the right ratio of it is. But connectivity is obviously important, and it's a way also to make sure that you can have feedbacks functioning in the system when you have flow of information. So you know when you're getting, close to thresholds that might be dangerous. And then lastly, equitability, availability and fairness. Helps to make the whole system strong by avoiding weak links in the system. So it obviously has ethical implications, but it has just simple structural implications too for the resilience of a system. Okay, so for resilient communities then, and this was published, this work, just recently in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, so you can go there to read more about it. But so one of our messages is we need to be intentional about managing urban green infrastructure for these traits if we want to create the most resilient communities through urban green infrastructure. And another point of our work, and it's come from, this focus on social ecological systems, is that we need to consider the social as well as the ecological dimensions of all of these traits. And just let me give you a couple of examples. We're all very familiar with, species richness and the genetic diversity inherent in that. We clearly need to build that into our green infrastructure for resilience, especially adaptation. But we also need to think about the social dimensions of diversity and make sure we're building in cultural and institutional diversity of, for example, green space stewardship groups, so that people can share ideas. They have different ways of doing things, and there may be an idea there that's important in making an adaptation to change, for example. Another example of this would be with connectivity. Green space corridors are a great sort of ecological example of how we can build in connectivity and make sure that we're sort of enhancing overall minimum viable population size, making sure species have the access to resources that they need. But we also need to build in those information pathways between, social groups so that they can talk to one another, learn from one another, et cetera. And for each of these traits, then we had fun thinking about, the social analogs of each of the ecological analogs. And I won't go through them now, but we talk about this more in the publication. So I want to wrap up by saying the question still, though, is how to operationalize all this information. And our vision is a spatial data platform, GIS based, that would have layers, ecological layers, social layers, climate layers, and that built into these layers would be lots of data, but certainly data on the resilience traits of the layers. So what is the diversity of your urban forest, for example, and so on. And so with this kind of system of information, then planners can start to do things like, figure out where the weaknesses are, where do they have strengths in green infrastructure, or where do they need to build in more to meet a particular climate vulnerability like flooding, or a particular social vulnerability like access to food. And then, of course, building in these traits helps these planners make sure that they're building in the highest resilience that they can to those urban green infrastructure layers. So we went about the task of building this kind of platform. Our vision is to do it like for the state of Indiana. We're starting with Indianapolis and Bloomington. And we acquired data from diverse sources and partners, including government, local as well as state, consulting firms like Davy Resource Group, which basically handles all the urban forest inventories, broadly across the nation. So we got lots of data from them. What else? Non-governmental groups in some cases, and I'm not sure if actually in some cases like Keep Indianapolis Beautiful, we got some of our tree data as well. And sometimes we actually went out on our own because no existing GIS data existed, and used GPS units to map the green space that we needed to get into the system. And so this has resulted in turning our vision into reality. We have developed what we call the Indiana Green City Mapper, and the link to it is shown at the bottom of the screen. And so it is this spatial database. Again, it's focused on Bloomington and Indianapolis, though already certain of our layers are extend to many more cities in Indiana. And we keep working all the time to build it. I want to have a shout out. Hannah's picture at the lower right, Hannah Gregory. She is a BS, Bachelor of Science graduate of Indiana University's Environmental Science program. And she has been a wonderful colleague. She has amazing technical skill and she's really the heart and soul of our spatial data platform in terms of all of its technical components. So the platform includes data layers like I showed you, and then all the associated metadata, which means stuff like when was the data taken, when was it last updated, various details about the data that are important for people to know if they want to work with it. And Hannah's also built in various tools and widgets that enable people to extract data on resilience traits, as well as to enable spatial analyses, start to layer and see where green infrastructure is strong versus weak, etc. So I want to wrap up then with a few conclusions from what I've told you today. From what I've showed you, invasive species are definitely getting an advantage from herbivore pressure on native species in urban green spaces like urban woodlands. These are passenger dynamics and they must be addressed if we're going to have restoration success. I've also touched on that place-based and integrated research, teaching, and service is really an effective model, at least for my lab. It's led to more robust science where, by actually engaging in the practice, we've seen things that's led us to investigate, more science. It also leads to retention of knowledge in the students that are involved in learning through this mechanism. And in general, it's supporting a wide base of knowledge to action. And then last 2 points, social and ecological dimensions of core resilience traits, the 6 that I talked about, I think yield a promising framework to guide urban green infrastructure towards greater resilience. And a spatial data platform for urban green infrastructure and associated social and climate change data layers is a first step towards strategic resilience trait-based planning. It's a huge task, but we've shown that it is doable through inter and transdisciplinary partnerships. And so I think, oh yeah, future directions. Just really briefly on the passenger side, we've got this big community science project called Restore, where we're working with private landowners, where there isn't a lot of help for private landowners to become more literate and figure out what are the ecological interactions on their own land. And so we're working with 20 landowners throughout Bloomington. We've set up experiments in their woodlands. So we've removed invasive species and then we've put in deer exclosures or not, and we've planted in palatable versus unpalatable native woodland understory species or not. And we're looking to see then, this will give us a sense of how much deer pressure, where is it an issue? Where do landowners need to be concerned about the deer pressure if they're going to restore their land properly? And then maybe they can use less palatable species if that's the case. And along with that, looking too at pedagogical aspects like, are we resulting in more ecological literacy in our community through this approach? And then with the platform, we want to just start applying it. There's also another mapping tool that's focused more on social aspects, but using those two together, we can start to look at things like the equity of urban forest. We're already starting to do that. Are there trait interactions or trade-offs among these resilience traits that we need to be aware of? And then ultimately, do we see measurable effects on climate change resilience when we have more or less urban green infrastructure and associated resilience traits built into it? So with that, I will thank you and take any questions. Put this back. Should I stop sharing or?
Yep, that would be best. Thank you.
Oh, there, now I can see you all better again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reynolds. That was a great presentation. And does anybody have any questions you can put into the chat?
And should I be looking at those or are you going to read them?
I can read them. So Dr. Brown, looks like you have a question.
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, Heather. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it. And also, I want to say I'm grateful that you kind of introduced Jen to service learning and applied projects, because I've had a lot of fun and it's been gratifying working with her on those types of projects around EKU and in Kentucky.
That's great.
And my question is, with the city mapper, it sounds familiar to me, like some of the Nature Conservancy's resiliency maps, and I don't really know the details of those, and maybe they are at a kind of a larger spatial extent and have kind of different types of data in them, but I don't know if you're familiar with the Nature Conservancy's resiliency maps and whether or not yours have similarities to those.
I am not specifically familiar with Nature Conservancy resiliency maps, so I need to check that out. I would assume the big difference is, we're focused on urban green infrastructure, so our layers are very social ecological. I'm expecting that their layers are focused, on nature preserve resilience, but nonetheless, I'm sure we can learn from them, and maybe likewise in terms of, thinking about the resilience of the system. So I am going to make a note to Google Nature Conservancy resilience maps, because I haven't seen them.
Yeah, in recent years, the Nature Conservancy is definitely more interested in kind of working lands and even kind of urban settings as well. So there might be some overlap.
Yeah. Thanks. And actually, if you have that link handy, put it in the chat and I'll grab it.
Okay.
Dr. Kelly? Yep.
Had a great seminar. I have a question. So you mentioned in Chicago, for example, they've got that beautiful native prairie that they've established, urban prairie. Once they get established, how self-sufficient are those sorts of habitats? Do they require constant maintenance, or are they kind of initial investment and they kind of take care of themselves down the road with some minor maintenance then?
Yeah, in my experience, it requires constant maintenance. And this is actually a point that I like to make, so I'm glad you asked the question. Just like gray infrastructure requires constant maintenance, right, to counter entropy and keep it functioning, huge budgets go into that. We should be equally willing and expect to put the maintenance effort into green infrastructure. Now, along the continuum of like wild to urban land, the more wild it is and the larger it is, presumably that cuts down on the investment we need to make. Although, as Bill McKibben has so eloquently said, right, the end of nature, there is no, climate, there is no space that is safe from disturbance. But so, and because of that, but we need to put effort everywhere, but especially in our urban environments, which are so they're smaller, they're fragmented. There's many more direct and ongoing sort of insults and challenges, invasive species continuously coming in as well. So yeah, we do. But so yeah, it's certainly not like a pie in the sky. Oh, just put in the green space, and we all know that, right? Whenever we've tried, even in our own lawn, to put in a native planting, it's gonna take a lot. But that too is inspirational to me, and there should be lots of niche niche entrepreneurial niches and jobs opening up in the field of green infrastructure. We can be training students to take on these variety of, I'd much rather, you know, have that kind of job than say, you know, a gray infrastructure job. So anyway.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? Or you can put them in the chat as well. Raise a hand or put them in the chat. I'm just going to check the gallery, see. All right, I'm not seeing anybody, so I think we'll go ahead and close. Thank you again, Dr. Reynolds, for coming today.